Hello and welcome to Dog Day Chess. In this episode we're going to look at the Philidor position in a rook-pawn endgame. The Philidor position is a particular rook and pawn versus rook endgame that the defending side can draw if the correct technique is used. It's named after André Philidor, who analyzed it in the late 1700s. It's also known as the third rank defense. The position that we're looking at is an example of the Philidor position. In this example, Black has the pawn, and Black would like to promote the pawn and win the game. White is the defending side. White is trying to draw the game. And because this is the Philidor position, White will be able to draw the game if the correct technique is used. We'll see that in a moment, but first let's look at the characteristics of the Philidor position. One characteristic is that the defending king is on the promotion square. Another is that the pawn has not yet advanced to the third rank. That is, if we're talking about a black pawn. If the position is reversed and Black is defending, then the white pawn must not have reached the sixth rank. Another characteristic is that the black king has not advanced to the third rank. And finally, the defending rook must be able to safely reach the third rank. So how can White draw the game from this position? Well, the first thing White needs to do is bring the rook to b3, preventing the black king from getting to the third rank. If White allows the black king to get to the third rank, then Black will be able to force a win. For example, if instead of blocking the black king's advance, the rook were to move to c1, say, then the king could move to g3, and if the rook tries to go up to the top of the board and attack the king from behind, Black can continue with rook to a1 check. After the king moves out, f3 check can be played, and after the king moves again, rook to e1 check, and after that, f2 can be played. And now, White will not be able to stop the pawn from promoting. Stepping back a bit, we can look at another scenario. If instead of going to the top of the board, the white rook stays on the last rank, then Black can push his pawn, and when the king goes to g1, the rook can check. If the king goes to f1, then the rook can go to h2, threatening to go to h1 and skewering the king to win the rook. If the king goes back to g1 to prevent the skewer, then Black can play f2 check, which forces the king to f1 and allows the skewer to happen anyway. So these are just a couple of ways that Black can win if the black king is allowed to get to the third rank. But if White gets his rook to the third rank and prevents that from happening, then it's a different story. Black will not be able to make progress. Checking the king with the rook will not get Black anywhere, because the white king can simply move out of check while staying in front of the pawn. If Black decides to advance the pawn, then the white rook can move to the top of the board and check the black king from behind. If the king stays with his pawn, then the game will be drawn by threefold repetition. If the king leaves his pawn and approaches the rook, then eventually the rook will be able to attack and win the pawn, leaving us with a drawn rook versus rook endgame. So if you find yourself on the defending side of a rook and pawn versus rook endgame, you should try to reach the Philidor position. If you reach it, you'll be able to use this technique to draw the game. As always, I hope you learned something from this episode, and thanks for watching.